ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial video. We are going to learn more about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrosky, bringing you these tutorials from my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video, we are taking a look at external data sources. If you've not used them, then this is a core fundamental that you need to know about. Let's head to my desktop, take a look at the file. All right, thank you for joining me here on my desktop. As you can see, I've got the launcher. It's up here. That normally opens up. We're going to talk about window positioning, all kinds of those good things. I'm going to start this video out with a little benefit that comes in the file. So what I'm doing is, as I'm copying elements from this file into the file that we have right here, one of them in particular is syntax highlighting. And that is a part of the MBS plugin as I bring up the system or the FileMaker's preferences. If you've not watched it, I have many videos where I go through the fact that the MBS plugin, I won't develop in FileMaker without it, primarily because it provides all of these different kinds of features, in particular, syntax colorization of scripts. Now, this is just a benefit that we get with this plugin, but one of the things that we have in here, and I've shot a video on YouTube about the MBS plugin. That's not what this video is about. This video is going to be about external data sources, but as we go along, I'm going to throw in any and every possible developer enhancement tip that I can get. You can see that I've created a folder called Developer. Always good idea to have one for yourself where you have scripts specifically to you. Now, you don't need to know everything that's going on in this script, other than when we get down to here in this area, we have a number of templates, or themes, I should say. These are just color sets that, according to how you like to develop, seeing colors in a very particular way is a very specific thing, and it varies from developer to developer. Maybe you like the color on white, which is what I'm using right now, or maybe you like the dark appearance right there. And you can see that when I click in there, I'm getting a little bit of different coloring of what's going on as opposed to the scripts, etc. These themes, the colors that I use are in this one. So all I have to do is, if I wanted FileMaker Plus, or if I want, let's go ahead with FileMaker Plus. If I want that to be active, I'm just going to go up here. I'm going to click this little run button. That is going to, I'll save it. That's literally changed the syntax coloring that is used. If I hide those now and I come in and come back in, you're going to see that the colors are completely different. Now, this is all controllable by you. So if we took a look at this and I double click and I move this over, we can see that all of my hex colors are right here in terms of what shows when I click in this. Again, the MBS plugin is doing this, but this is something that I put this into the launcher file for the very reason that the single first file that I ever open is the launcher file. In fact, if you're if you've been using FileMaker for a long time but you didn't know, in our file options, which we can always access by going up to the file menu and then going to our file options right there, which I simply brought up with Control A. Go take a look at the video about shortcut keys. We are able to specify a specific file that opens up. Is that in here somewhere? Icon spelling. Did I miss it on screen? Script triggers text. There was a ability somewhere, if it's not in the file options, but there is an ability in newer versions of FileMaker to automatically open the launcher file when you launch FileMaker. I just happen to use the recent menu. I love that. I can always go straight to my launcher or whatever I want. You, of course, can clear those, but I'm just so used to, I open FileMaker, FileMaker opens with nothing, I launch into the file, and then we have the environment that we want. So let me set this back to the colors that I like. This script will be available in the launcher, and there we are, back to my favorite colors. So easy to change that syntax coloring. So in our solutions, one of the core fundamentals of having a FileMaker file, and we're going to go into layout mode over here, and we're going to, the only field that we have right here on this particular layout, because it's our splash layout, is the account name. But I'm going to put this field on screen just so that we can talk about what's going on. Where the data comes from this field that we see on screen, FileMaker doesn't really care. This data can come from anywhere on the internet. It can come from most predominantly inside the FileMaker file itself. So let's talk about this. When we open up the defined database and we go to our tables area, we have some tables, and I'm keeping it really simple at this point. All we have is we're going to be populating our files. We'll be putting in some other things. In a previous lesson, we added users and sessions. Now, at the outset, when you are going to plan your FileMaker solution, what becomes critically important is your system architecture. How is FileMaker going to be used? If I'm going to be using FileMaker for multiple departments, for many different users, but those users are the same users in the whole of the organization, I have to ask myself, does it make sense for me to add a users and sessions table to each and every FileMaker file? The answer to that might be no. It might be I would much be better served by having a common users and sessions table and then just track, did they log into this FileMaker system or did they log into this FileMaker system? Because what you're going to end up doing is repeating a lot of things for all of the different systems that you develop. So if FileMaker is a core technology in your business, then it might make more sense to move that part of your system outside of the file that you're developing. Now, where does this come into play in our current solution? In our launcher, our whole goal is to simply make a single FileMaker file that looks like FileMaker, well, it doesn't look like it. It acts like FileMaker's launch area, where here I really don't have the ability to segment. I can't tag. I can't divide things up. I can't hide things. Like if I had 20 files listed in here, the Claris FileMaker launcher is going to show all 20 of them, and it is only specific to me. I can't share this with other users. However, with a FileMaker database, this is a multi-user solution. Multiple users can log in. Users can have their own. I can have common files. I can do whatever I want. So the whole goal being, when I select on an item here, and I click this little icon to launch the asset solution, the number one thing that we are interested in is having that launch. Now, we can do this with or without credentials that exist. If you go all the way back to the very first video where I introduced the launcher, down at the bottom, what we have is a relogin. This is simply going to launch the relogin script that we created in the previous, I believe it was in the previous video, where we simply took the relogin. Let's actually go over to the main solution. We have our relogin script right here, where its only purpose is to relog in by passing credentials in. Now, if we relog into this file, knowing that we're going to have many different FileMaker files, and each of those different FileMaker files, let's say these two different files have a different full account login or a login that I'm testing or whatever it is, I want to be able to launch this, and I can have the prompt come up, but it's a lot more convenient if it does not. So watch what happens when I click the asset solution to launch it. It's coming up with the prompt, and that is because my launcher file is currently logged in with credentials based on a username of Matt. Now, all of these example files that I have put into this launcher, I'm using the same username and password, admin and admin, and I would like to be able to simply launch these by clicking on them. So knowing that FileMaker from one file to the next file passes along credentials, if you've already been authenticated one time into a file and that same authentication matches another file, then it won't prompt you. So when I click this and we relog in as admin, and granted I have to have those credentials in my launcher. But remember, the launcher is really only going to be on our local development machine. So we're usually okay with putting our credentials in, all of the different credentials that log into all of the other FileMaker files that we might log into. When I select this now, you'll notice that the solution comes right up. And again, if I'm working on another solution, I'll select that one and I will launch that one. You can see that I've instantly been able to jump from my launcher into these two different solutions because the credentials are passed. But here's the kicker. In order to connect one FileMaker file to another FileMaker file, we are going to have to become familiar with, in the Manage area, our external data sources. Now, at the very outset, what I mentioned is that when we looked at that field over in our solution, and we'll go ahead and close these, this field, the data can come from anywhere. It can come from inside this FileMaker file. It can come from a separate FileMaker file. It can also come from ODBC sources, MySQL, SQL Server, many different SQL sources. So when we head into that Manage External Data Sources, what we're going to be doing through the remainder of this video is making sure that you are aware of all of the details of what is possible and what's happening when you use the Manage External Data Sources. This is also going to come into play when you learn the data separation model. It's going to benefit you when you're trying to do field mapping using imports and exports, and you want the connection to the file to be variable, but you also need to have a fixed connection in order to make those fields match up on import and export. And it also applies when you're going to connect to an external data source such as ODBC, which we're not going to go into in this video, but it's important to know that once you put in a DS in, that's going to require a separate driver. There's all kinds of different things you need to do to set up. But the point being, no matter where the data source is coming from, you are going to be able to have fields on your layout that can be from multiple different sources. So what we're going to do is, in this video, we are going to pretend that we want to architect this launcher from the standpoint that not only is the launcher going to take advantage of the users, but other FileMaker files or systems that we set up. So we want to centralize our users. And while we will be developing the users and sessions in this file, which we already have connected them up, we're going to take a look at how easy it would be to simply move this over and separate all of that functionality out. So without further ado, let's head into taking a look at that. All right, so let's set up our connection as if we were connecting this to a centralized users. Now, clearly, from the file that we're working on, Launcher 2, we have no external data sources. Well, the first thing we need is another data source. So if it was ODBC, or you can connect via JDBC, then I would be setting up my driver, making a connection, and there's all kinds of things that go into that. But showing that field on the layout, it really doesn't matter. We're going to work with just FileMaker files for the purpose of simplicity. So I need a new file. I will create a new file. It's going to be a blank file that we see right there. We'll click Create, and I've already got a folder on my in my system where I've got a folder called Connected, which is on my desktop. And I'm simply just going to call this users. Now, I might not want to, if it's managing users and sessions, I might want to call it something else, but for simplicity, we're going to walk through this as the process. So, if I was going to do a simple reconnect, in other words, I need to have everything that would be exactly the same if I wanted to break this system out, meaning I would be able to go into my main solution, go to my users table, and then I would presumably be able to Command A or Control A, select everything, copy this, and then go over to my other table and paste it. I want the exact same thing if I was going to swap so that the users table that I had internally is going to be used externally. For right now, I'll go ahead and I'll copy it. We'll click cancel. We'll go over, just for the sake of fun, we'll go ahead and delete all of that, and I'll paste everything just so that everything is exactly the same as we walk through this process. Sometimes you want to use that as an opportunity to basically remove deprecated fields that are no longer in use, if you're going to use this at a later point in time, choosing to move or migrate some of the data out of your main system. So we now have our separate users table. That means we go into our Manage External Data Sources, we click on New, and then we just call this whatever it's going to be. So in this case, I'll call it the same thing, users. And what we have now is a couple of opportunities that we want to take advantage of and be very familiar with what happens. In particular, this right here, the file path list is in search order, meaning whatever FileMaker finds that it hits first, that it connects to, that's the one that wins. Now, down at the bottom, we are going to have a variety of ways that we can connect to another file. In this particular case, my launcher is currently hosted on FileMaker server. So when I make a connection to this other file, what it's going to do is it's going to use a full path. And that's because one is on a machine, well, what my machine thinks is a different machine, but it's actually in a container on my computer. The physical file is on my same hard disk, but it's as if it's on a separate location like FileMaker server, where this file is going to be local in my operating system. Now, clearly, you're probably familiar with being able to click on the add file, and then you select the file, and then it will just add it into the dialog here. Now, if we're going to talk about the path order, and we're going to look at our options down here, one of the most advantageous options right here is a variable file path, which means when our FileMaker file starts up, that file itself can determine what its current state is. It can say to itself, am I hosted on the network, or am I local on a drive? And if you understand this principle, you are able to do all kinds of things with FileMaker. You can, for example, have a local file on a iOS device, iPhone or iPad, within FileMaker Go that says, oh, I recognize that I'm on the local device. I'm going to need to connect to a network-hosted file. Or you can do the inverse. You can open a network-hosted file, and then that network-hosted file can say to itself, well, I'd also like to refer or reference some local data that comes from the device. Knowing this allows you to architect all kinds of wonderful solutions. So predominantly what I do these days, and we're going to see where this actually comes into play with our launcher and how I'm actually using the launcher. Typically what you're going to do as a first option is use a variable file path. And you can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call this data.external. External, right there. Now, if you go look at FileMaker standards, the reason that I capitalize anything that is a global variable or a global field is it allows me to distinguish between what is actual data versus what is something that is used that is temporary in nature. In other words, once this FileMaker solution shuts down, whatever is stored in that, it goes away. It's gone. But each time the solution loads up, that is going to be populated, hopefully, with something where this is the first thing that is evaluated. This path, being variable, is where you can make those decisions based on how and where the user is using your FileMaker solution. So by having this be next in line, if this is not populated with a value that FileMaker correctly evaluates and connects to, then it will move on to the next one and just keep going down this list of all of these paths of finding files. Now, the next logical one would be a relative file, which would be right here. We can see at the bottom there, file directory path. So if I put in file, and then I put something like the file name, I don't have to have a directory. This could be just users right here. And note that in here, FileMaker doesn't necessarily require you to put the FMP12. You don't have to have the extension, as indicated by the fact that when I clicked on the add file, FileMaker simply added this and did not include the .fmp12. But I believe if you put it in there, I don't believe FileMaker complains. But in this scenario, what happens is, first off, if my variable is populated with something that does get evaluated and FileMaker can connect to it, FileMaker will use that. If not, it moves on to the next. In this case, because this file is hosted, if it sees another file on FileMaker server named users, then it would use that. Likewise, if I was to actually put a folder in here and that folder existed and worked, then it would evaluate that path as long as FileMaker can find it. But our ultimate and final path is what we want to add when we're doing development to a file that allows us to get to it in order to do our mappings for our imports. And this may be just a simple matter of making a copy of your FileMaker file and putting it in a place where you can actually resolve this. I like to use not relative paths, but paths that are separate, where I point to an absolute separate folder in order to map those things, knowing that this absolute path in the course of normal production use will absolutely not get hit. And that's what allows me to develop confidently, make my mappings, and then be able to have this be set when the actual application is in use. All right. So now that we've covered that, and we've got all of our paths in here, what we're going to do is we are now going to set up what looks like the exact same thing in our FileMaker solution, but prove the point that FileMaker doesn't care where the data comes from. All right, so let's wire up, or let's basically add into our launcher that user solution and then go through the process of maybe swapping it out and taking a look on the graph. First off, what happens is once we've got in our manage external data sources, once we have an external data source and it can be accessed, which in this case it's going to be hitting, this is the final path that's actually resolving from the standpoint of this file. And the great thing is once you make this connection, even if the connection breaks, as long as you reestablish a path to the file, it will reconnect just automatically, which is really pretty nice. But if we go into layout mode here, and if I want to create a new layout, now if I create a new layout, actually we need to put it on the graph first if it didn't get added. So I'm going into the manager, the defined database, going into the relationships. We can see that currently on my graph, I'm not going to be able to create a layout based on that external file unless I add a table occurrence. But here comes a very important concept. From the second that I add a table occurrence onto the graph, and when FileMaker opens a connection and connects to that file, if it is on the graph anywhere, you will not be able to close the file, meaning that external file cannot be shut down. FileMaker establishes the connection from the time that it first sees it, and then you can never get rid of it. There are times where you want to have an external file that can provide data, but you want to be able to close it out. And the way that you're going to do that is through scripts. You can use a script in your main file to call a script in your external file, get some data, hand it back, and then you're able to close that file out, meaning shut it down. This comes into play very rarely, but it is a useful thing to know. So let's go into our scripts and take a look. Let's use our sandbox right here. We'll simply just add a couple of steps. I'll add an exit right here, an exit script so that everything below it never gets triggered, never gets fired. But we're going to add a perform script where we want to perform a script, and we're able to specify that user's file. So if we look at the user's file, we're going to get this prompt right here, which is something that we glossed over a little bit when we took a look at permissions. So if we say yes right here, what happened is we need to understand that first. First off, we can see that in the user's file that we created, there are no scripts. So we'll need an example script. We'll cancel that for right now. We'll switch over. We'll go to our user's file. There are no scripts. We're going to create a script, and we're going to call this hand back data right here. And we're just going to put in an exit script, and we're going to say this is something from the data file. Well, let's call it the user's file. And this is essentially what the data separation model is, being able to use an external file and be able to swap in and out different UI files, which is really pretty advantageous. So now that we have that one script, in our scripts over here, when we switch to our data source of our user's file, there is that file, that script handback data. Now that data could have come from tables. It could have come from, any type of an execute data API script. It can come from a SQL query. It can come from a regular FileMaker find query, copying the data, however the data gets back, and can come back as JSON, what have you. We know that if we run this, what we're going to get from that script is everything that we said. So if we do a show dialog here, and in this dialog, we're just going to put in result, and here we're going to put get script result, and we'll take that button of cancel off, and we'll say okay. What's going to happen is this script, runs it in the external file. That returns its result, which we can see. We'll run the debugger. We'll step into this. We'll say perform that script. It goes over to that script. We can see that we're in the user's file. When we look at our call stack down here using the debugger, we were in our main file, and that called a script over in the other file. It got some data. It's handing that data back, this is something from the user's file. We now can access that with the get script result. So when we show the dialog, we can see this is something from the users, and I forgot the word file. So you can see that that's pretty cool to be able to interact between the two files. But it doesn't stop right there. And the only reason that I'm showing you this is that if I wanted to, after that ran, be able to get rid of the user's file. So in other words, let's run this scenario right here. We'll do a close file, and we'll close the user's file. We want to know how this works. So right now, we can always go up to the window menu and check what's open. Currently, the user's is open in the background. Close that. Let's go up to our window. You can see that it is no longer open. That file was closed out for good, meaning users is not open. So now I am going to run this script again, and we can see that by adding the close file, what is going to happen is the file is going to get flushed out and no longer maintained or being opened by FileMaker. So if we run this script, we'll do it with the debugger. We'll step in, we've got our result, we'll show our result, we will close that file, we'll exit this script, we go up to the window menu, users is still open in this case, and it's probably because of the debugger. So let's go ahead and run the script. We'll close the file, we can see that it's closed, there is no window that's showing, and we will just run the script. And now we'll check the window. And you can see right there, that is my result. So that's a key thing to note as well. If you're stepping through with the debugger, FileMaker does keep that file open in the background. In this scenario, when we just run the script, FileMaker does every one of those steps reliably, including the close file to the users. Now, how does this differ from when we put this on the graph? And this is the important concept. This step will not close that file no matter what from the very first time that we put any table occurrence onto the graph of an external file. So we'll go into Define Database. We go down to our tables and our relationships. We click the plus sign, and our data source, rather than being a table that's in our current file, is going to be a table over in the users file, and we're going to put the users right there. So the way that we can always tell in FileMaker that something is external is that right there. That's the only way that we can tell, is the fact that it's italicized. It's a little too subtle in my opinion, and so typically what you want to do is you're going to want to color this using your color options down at the bottom right here as being something to the extent of, being external. Now, I happen to use red in order to identify my table occurrences that use cascading deletes or control. The cascading deletes being, I'm going to have separate groups of table occurrences that control nothing but deletes. And so that's what I use red for. So maybe you'll pick a different color, use something like orange as a warning to let you know that that particular table occurrence is an external data source. Now, as soon as we put this on the graph, the benefit to us is that all of this data in a separate file, which can be used by any number of other FileMaker files, can be seen, interacted with, and you can do everything in this file that you can do in the other file with scripts and with data interaction. So when we go into our layout mode, and we are going to create a new layout, and as that comes up, what we're going to see is that we've got multiple options. We have got our users table occurrence, which we know is a table in our current file. We also have our users2, which we know is a users table in a separate file. It is not in this file. So if I specify this particular table occurrence of users2 and say finish, you can see that all of these fields, we'll just grab all of them and we will bring them all on screen. And we go into this. If we compare these two, I'm going to go up to the window and I'm going to create a new window. And that window, I am going to switch to my users. We can compare and contrast what's going on. So currently, when this file starts up, it checks the users table. Currently, the users table is local in this same file. But I've now connected a separate users table, and that is in a separate file. Well, as long as I have the same field names, or as long as the connections are the same, watch how easy this is to actually swap this out. Remember, when I set this up, this users table had all of my fields. If the fields that are used for the relationships themselves, as long as they stay the same, or there is a same name, I am able to move my users data from being internal to my file that I'm building, my launcher file, to being external, so that not just my launcher file could take advantage of that users table, but any other FileMaker solution. Now, caveat, this can get super complex if you're not very diligent about your documentation and making sure that when you architect things in this fashion, that you're very explicit about what's going on. But from the standpoint of being able to swap this out, and I've taught users how to migrate a single FileMaker file to a data separation model where you've got other benefits. And there are some developers that they don't prefer the data separation model, and it's for this one, primarily this one critical reason. With the data separation, you do have to have the same users and privileges in both files if you're going to be managing those users in FileMaker. If you use external users, which we talked about earlier in this series, then that really goes away if you're using Azure or Active Directory, something that centralizes the users into groups. Likewise, there are always situations where there's data that you need to deal with when you're scripting, and in the past, that used to apply a little bit more before FileMaker had technologies that allowed you to basically get the data and interact with it. You had to write a script in the separate file and then call that script. Well, that's sort of gone away. With the external execute data API FileMaker script and the ability to run SQL if you're going to be using a plugin, getting access to your data that's in a separate file from the file that you're using as your main UI is really not a problem these days. But this is how easy it is to swap this. I can just simply switch to users, select the users, and click OK. That's it. FileMaker will swap, and as long as it has matching things or matching values, and that did stay the same, right? We'll go into the discard, and we can see that it did move off of, it switched that last login. So I do want to pay attention to that in terms of the fact that that happened is where in users, because of, it may be because of the account name or the last login, but you can see that when I switched this from users to the users table over there, even though I copied all of the fields, it's changing that last login field right here to the created on and the ID. So I would need to go investigate that in terms of getting this wired up properly. I do want to pay attention to that, but it may be because of the complexity of this particular connection in terms of how these are wired up and connected. But by and large, it is oftentimes possible to simply just swap to an external table. And as long as things are named the same, then you can do that swap just really easily. And as soon as you get out of the graph by clicking OK, then it accepts it and it goes on with that process. Otherwise, if it doesn't work out the way that you want or you expect, clicking cancel, you will just simply discard, and then you're going to be able to go look at what the reason is why it wouldn't actually wire up or connect or transfer directly over. All right, and so how does this impact us when we have the table occurrence on the graph? So because this exists and it's an external file on the graph, once it gets on the graph, when we run this script, to run a script in an external file, and then we attempt to close this, we will see that it will not close. I will click the little run button right here. The script just ran. We got our data back from the data file. However, it came back, but when we go up to the window menu, we can see that the user's file is still open in the background. In fact, we can't even close it. And if you don't know, these parentheses simply means that a file is open in the background, or it's basically a hidden window. If we select this, then the show window will go gray, but we will be able to see that the file right there is in the background. Now, if we try to close this file right there, FileMaker will not allow that file to be closed. We can see that it simply just reopened it, or it maybe never even closed it, in the background and just made that file hidden. And that is because of this right here. Because this is referencing the external data source on the graph, it will persist and stay open. So if you ever need a situation where you need to be able to interact with a file that needs to be closed for some reason, let's say it needs to be swapped in or out for some other file, maybe a new fresh copy, what have you, then that's what you're going to need to know, is you cannot have it on the graph. As soon as you do, then it will persist as long as it's actually connected when the graph is initially evaluated by FileMaker when it opens. So all that having been said, what does all of that we discussed have to do with this launcher? Well, if we take a look at our data viewer, what we're going to see is the way that I have taken advantage of this aspect within FileMaker is that when we run one of these scripts, and we'll bring up the debugger right here, and we'll click on this assets, we'll actually select that, we'll move the debugger to the side, and we will click the launcher right here, and we will open ID. So first off, without going into it, JSON is going to be the fundamental way that we're going to pass things back and forth for scripts and all kinds of stuff. It is the way to develop. I'm not going to teach you any other way other than simple parameters or JSON. And those are the only two that we're going to use. We're not going to use anything else. But in this particular case, what I have, as we run through this script, we can see that what it's doing is it's simply going to establish a path. And once that path is actually valid, it's going to launch that particular file. So we can see that the file launched right there. And when we go back to our launcher, what we're going to see is that I'm using variables in order to manage each one of these. And all that I've done is I've taken the opportunity, when we look at the external data sources, is to simply just identify a number of files that could be opened from my launcher that are using an external file path. That external file path can be populated from field data based on the record of the object that's going, or the item that's going to be launched. So if we look at this, and this is we're going to get into UI and why this is not a good UI setup right here. When I select on this particular item right here, I want to be able to configure it. I've got my configure up in this little area right here where I make the selection of the gear icon. Let's move this off to the side. But you can see that what happens is, in this particular case, when we look at the launcher file, file 1 and file 2 have been used. Now, I'm able to make a comparison of whatever files are currently open or what is intending to be opened. So if I cycle through all of these different variables, when I close this solution and then I look for it again. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to close the asset solution and we'll select the asset solution again. Because I'm going to click on the button that launches the solution, it's going to simply look at whether or not any of these variables that contain the path to the file, which in this case the path is a hosted file. FMNet means it's on the FileMaker network, the domain that we're going to, and then the name of the file right there. And you can see that you can either have the .fmp12 or not. So I do have it here. I do not have it here. FileMaker will work either way. But when I click this and that file launches up and I switch back to my launcher, you can see that no new file was actually created. Yet, if I was to launch, I don't know if I have another one connected. I don't. Well, let's go ahead and connect it. So we've got, I don't know what these are actually called. You need the exact same file names, or the exact file name. So if I took this right here and the service order solution, I click that, it does not have a path. If I put that path in, and if I called it the right thing, which would be probably service orders, let's take a guess right here. I don't know that this will work, but let's see if it does. Nope, we're getting error right here, which the script is saying it can't find that path. It exhausted all of them. And you can see that it did attempt to actually make that connection onto a variable called file.o3. So this is the core fundamental of how this launcher is working. A lot of people in the past have created launchers, but the problem is what you end up doing is you end up having an ever-growing list of all of the possible files, because all of the files are uniquely identified by the fact that, this is the asset solution, this is the invoice solution, this is customer XYZ, this is customer ABC, this is customer 007. And what happens is you end up having an endless growing collection. Wherein, if you think about this from the standpoint of I'm only at the most ever going to have 10 files open, if you give yourself a list of 10 files, but allow each of those paths to be variable, then that means your launcher really never needs to have any more than those 10 variables, because you're never really going to have more than 10 files open within a day. If you are, then just bump it to 20. 20 is not a difficult number to manage. But that is the core of the external data source. Without going into the ODBC, which you'll know if you need it, if you're needing to connect to external sources, and whether you're using ODBC, JDBC, whatever external driver you use. I believe Active Technologies is the name of the Mac driver. I've used it before to connect to MySQL, MariaDB databases, what have you. Once you've got all of that set up, FileMaker is obviously very flexible. It is able to serve as the source, or it's able to connect to a source and then show those fields within a layout no matter where they come from. But in this video, hopefully you've learned that by taking advantage of the external data source and the fact that you can use a variable means that you can use this launcher, and the launcher can hold hundreds, thousands of different solutions. But at any given time, you're only ever going to have a few open that you're working on at that time. And by using this variable within the external data source, we're able to take advantage and use this launcher in a really cool way. We're also able to know that by not having it on the graph, so if I go into the graph of the main launcher file, which is really simple, because there are none of the files that the launcher file is launching, because none of those have a table occurrence on the graph, I am able to close those files. And because of that, I can also take advantage of that knowledge to be able to do all kinds of unique things by, say, for example, having a local file that can import data and do pre-processing instead of making back and forth round trips to a hosted FileMaker file. Think about this sequence. You've got a local user. They're connecting to a remote hosted FileMaker file like this. But they need to process some data, and you can build that logic into a FileMaker file. Well, a very common scenario is that from the hosted FileMaker file, you export a local file. Let's say this is a file that's local on the computer's machine, in the temporary folder, what have you. There is a button somewhere that says Process Excel Spreadsheet. It loads that Excel spreadsheet, does all of the heavy lifting on the user's local machine, and then once the data has been refined, then you push that up very concisely up to your main network hosted FileMaker solution. These are core fundamental tenets of wise programming that allows you to optimize things because you're taking advantage of the local machine first, instead of doing a lot of network heavy traffic, which FileMaker is actually very bad at. FileMaker is not network optimized by any means, and we need to do everything we can to take advantage of FileMaker's strengths versus its weaknesses. And being that network traffic is not one of its strengths, it's one of its weaknesses in terms of how much it transfers, how often, and the polling and the frequency. We need to work around that, and that's how we can use these external data sources in order to do that. And that's why I'm showing you this at the outset, even though we're not taking advantage of it in this particular launcher file solution. So hopefully that gives you some more information about working with FileMaker, how you can take advantage of what it offers. I'd like to wish you much luck, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.